Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be reviewing something that is really in my wheelhouse as an industrial and organizational psychologist. We're going to be looking at research on personality, and in particular, we're going to be reviewing this tweet thread by Keith Woods on left-wing authoritarian politics, its relationship with narcissism and psychopathy. And so we assume there is a relationship just based off of our observations, but let's see what the research has found. The research found a strong correlation between left authoritarianism and dark triad traits. So dark triad traits are things that were studied by, blanking on the two names. One is Robert Hare, who is big on the dark triad, and the other is, what was it? It's going to bother me now if I don't find it. Who is the big person on dark triad? Paulus. Paulus, he's in Canada. That's the name, Paulus. Paulhus. And so the dark triad, sometimes expanded to the dark tetrad. The dark triad is psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. And the dark tetrad adds in, I think, something like a sadism dimension to it. And people go back and forth on if the dark tetrad is the correct unit of analysis or if we should just be talking about one underlying kind of evil trait. But for this, I believe we're going to be talking about specifically narcissism and psychopathy, so I don't think the Machiavellianism aspect as much, just given Keith Wood's first post. So let's see what he has to say here. He says they conclude that for these people, their left-wing views are simply a way for them to express power over others. So let me see what this says. Okay, I need a different... Okay, so that's just the name of it, so you don't have to see that. Let's see what this says. Okay. Wish I had a different view of this, but I will read it so you don't have to be confused about what it says. So the results of multiple regression analysis showed that a strong ideological view, according to which a violent revolution against existing societal structures is legitimate, so anti-hierarchical aggression, was associated with antagonistic narcissism and psychopathy. However, neither dispositional altruism nor social justice commitment was related to left-wing anti-hierarchical aggression. Considering these results, we assume that some leftist political activists do not actually strive for social justice and equality, but rather use political activism to endorse or exercise violence against others to satisfy their own ego-focused needs. We discuss these results in relation to the dark ego vehicle principle. Okay, so I don't know the dark ego vehicle principle, but let me see if I can get a better view of this. Hold on a second. That did not work at all. So yeah, I will just go over this. And okay, so when it talks about anti-hierarchical aggression, that means that things like the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. It means things like, what's another good one here? It means things like the rich versus the poor, the 99% versus the 1%, things like that. And so it's saying that antagonistic narcissism, so a self-centeredness that forces you or is related to you being hostile towards others, are related, and so is psychopathy related to it. But it's saying also that social justice commitment and dispositional altruism. So dispositional altruism would be, instead of it being something that is transient, dispositional means it's like intrinsic to you, it's a part of you. So altruism, that long-lasting altruism, is not really related to anti-hierarchical aggression, given the different measures they used here. And social justice commitment is also not related to that. So it really does seem to be just a person's kind of pathological hostility to others their narcissism and psychopathy. That seems to be what is related to these outcomes. So let's see what else it says here. So in 1906, a socialist named John Spargo wrote on the pathologies he believed had informed the Bolshevik Revolution. Spargo had first-hand contact with leading Bolsheviks. He was shocked by the ease with which they could hold contradictory views on issues like free speech. Spargo observed what he called hysterical hyperesthesia among the Bolshevik leadership. Many of the symptoms of this condition he described were things we would today associate with narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so let's see what it says. Exaggerated egoism, extreme intolerance, intellectual vanity, hypercriticism, self-indulgence, craving for mental and emotional excitement, excessive dogmatism, hyperbolic language, impulsive judgment, emotional instability, intense hero worship, propensity for intrigues and conspiracies, rapid alternation of extremes of exaltation and depression, violent contradictions in tenaciously held opinions and beliefs, periodic, swift, and unsystematic changes in mental attitudes. Not every individual invariably exhibits all of these characteristics, of course, nor are these the only characteristic generally symptomatic of hysteria to be observed in this type. Okay, so interesting observations of the Bolshevik leadership. So exaggerated egoism, so that could be that narcissism, extreme intolerance. We do see that among a lot of leftists now, where they've really purity spiraled, where unless you are a black, trans, gay, what's it, two souls or whatever it is, furry, I mean, you have to touch so many different categories. You have to be a part of so many different intersectional categories that really it's become ridiculous. And the more of these underrepresented, discriminated against categories you are a part of, the higher you are in this victim hierarchy. And that's not really a way that you put together a society. It's not a way that a civilization can really function. And it's based off of extreme intolerance, where they pretend like they're extremely tolerant. But I've met these people. I've been a part of psychology departments where these people, they hate straight people, they hate Christians, they hate white people, they hate males. It's extreme intolerance, absolutely. Intellectual vanity, that's a fun one too, because these people are some of the dumbest people you'd ever meet. I remember one professor, this was in my undergrad, she was extremely disliked by students, even her own students who were a part of her research teams. She would write them really bad letters of recommendation despite them helping her. She apparently graduated her doctorate with D grades because she would brag about that in class. I mean, she was just absolutely, absolutely hated, but she was, from what I've heard, one of the most arrogant people possible. Yeah, hypercriticism is another one they mention here. I mean, they are both the most critical people and the most thin-skinned to criticism ever. And then it talks about things like self-indulgence here. And we do see that in our very hedonistic culture, where these people really have completely controlled the narrative for, I would say, 100 years now. They've been taking over various cultures, various nations, various civilizations, particularly the West. And then they've been using the West in order to topple other civilizations. And they're doing it based off of tempting people with self-indulgence, with hedonism, things like that. So yeah, it goes on to say things like emotional instability. I mean, I see that neuroticism all the time amongst these people. Like, the disconnect between people's actions and the consequences of their actions is just mind-boggling. I know a number of people who, particularly women in their 30s, who are extremely, extremely, extremely unhappy with their lives, but then they tell other people, younger women, to do the exact same thing that they did, even though it led to a negative outcome. And so there's this emotional instability there, but they cover it up, they hide it. Okay. Yeah, rapid alterations of extremes of exaltation and depression. You see that all the time. And quite frankly, some of the time I do think that it's faked exaltation. And they're mostly just depressed and putting on a front. Yeah, violent contradictions and tenaciously held opinions and beliefs. I mean, periodic, swift, and unsystematic changes in mental attitude. You see this all the time. I was very confused about how so many of them could be pro-Ukraine and then also pro-Israel. You quite frankly see that on the right too, because they've been completely captured as well as the left by this. It's funny because the people we call communists nowadays are very far away from this Bolshevik leadership, and the people who are American conservative do tend to have a lot of these similar characteristics, particularly when it comes to their talk of Israel. Like, it talks about intense hero worship here. I mean, there are so many interesting aspects where it does seem like this Bolshevik mindset that Spargo is talking about here, it took over both left-wing circles, but also right-wing Zionist circles as well. And quite frankly, it does seem to come back to Zionism on both ends, whether it's left-wing Zionism or right-wing Zionism. These types of characteristics are very Zionist in nature. So next is, indeed, recent studies suggest an extremely close relationship between narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism. Spargo's observations may be more universal than he realized. Okay, so let's look at what this relationship is. Previous studies regarding the relationship between narcissism and global left-wing authoritarianism found left-wing authoritarianism to be positively correlated with antagonistic narcissism. Okay, so that's a huge relationship between left-wing authoritarianism and antagonistic narcissism, an R of 0.61. What we traditionally say is, if two constructs have a relationship of R of about 0.7 or higher, we would actually consider them to be the same thing essentially, because there's some degree of measurement error that we can expect. And we say it's something around like 0.2, 0.3 for measurement error is our very cautious estimate. And so if there's a 0.7 or a 0.8, an R of 0.7 or 0.8, we would say that's a lot of convergent validity, and that's reason to assume that they're essentially the same thing. So here, a 0.61 is pretty strong. If we are finding a relationship between variables in the social sciences and they're not the same construct, we typically expect it to be something like a R of 0.1 to an R of 0.3, which would describe a relationship of like 2% of the variance predicted to like a 9 or 10% of the variance predicted is pretty normal, going from an R to an R squared, but you don't need to know some of these things. Anyways, left-wing authoritarianism, what I'm essentially saying here, is extremely related to antagonistic narcissism, almost to the point of being the exact same thing. Left-wing authoritarianism is related to extroverted narcissism. And that's about what you'd expect. That's a decently high correlation we would find in the social and behavioral sciences. And then neurotic narcissism is also decently related as well. We typically put an R of like 0.3 as a high correlation, R of 0.2 as a moderate, and R of 0.1 as a low correlation. You typically need multiple predictor variables in order to get above a 0.3 here. So a 0.6 with left-wing authoritarianism and antagonistic narcissism, I would say is very high, and I think a lot of people in the social and behavioral sciences would agree. Okay, so the results of these studies also showed that left-wing authoritarianism was most strongly predicted by antagonistic narcissism, okay? And they just show the p-values here. I won't really get into what p-values mean exactly, but just know that these are statistically significant, and so we think that these are true results. Okay, so they are looking at multiple predictors here. So looking at multiple predictors gets rid of the extra shared prediction between these variables and just looks at what is unique to each of them. So left-wing authoritarianism has a 0.34 relationship with antagonistic narcissism, and that's still statistically significant even once you include the other variables in it. Then neurotic narcissism, 0.17, again, that's like low to moderate correlation. And then extroverted narcissism is no relationship. It's all accounted for by these other two variables, which is really interesting there. So extroverted narcissism has no relationship. Oh, that's interesting, because that was actually the second highest relationship aside from antagonistic narcissism. So it seems like there's some unique relationship between neurotic narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism, as well as antagonistic narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism. But we can move on from there. So another who took the study of this topic was the psychotherapist. I'm not going to pronounce it. Some Polish name, I think. He coined the term pathocracy to describe the process where a pathological minority rule over a majority. Often these are intellectuals that seize on the discontent of the majority. Yeah, you see that a lot with Zionists. They completely took control of our education system, and then through that, they took control of media and entertainment, journalism, our government, essentially. You see things like our government, it was like 99.99% of people in our legislative branch just voted to consider anti-Zionism to be the same as anti-Semitism. So you know they're completely captured by Zionism here. So this person had conducted secret research on the role of psychopaths in communist Poland. He discussed, yeah, I knew he was Polish just by the name. He discussed how psychopaths quickly realize the traumatic effect their personalities have on others and realize the power this gives them to advance their goals through terror. And so he goes on to say to individuals with various psychological deviations, the social structure dominated by normal people and their conceptual world appears to be a system of force and oppression. Psychopaths reach such a conclusion as a rule if at the same time a good deal of injustice does in fact exist in a given society. Pathological feelings of unfairness and suggestive statements emanating from deviants may then be easily propagated among both groups, although each group has completely different reason for favoring such ideas. Okay, so let's see if we understand what they're talking about here. Social strength. Okay, so he says that if you're psychopathic like these communist rulers of Poland were, then you see everything as a system of force and oppression. And if you're a psychopath, you have more tools in your toolbox to use force and oppression. So that's a good world for them if that's actually the truth. Psychopaths reach such a conclusion. Okay. So they're saying that they foment feelings of unfairness and try to get the rebels within society on their side. And it's the rebels on both sides. So it's the far right extremists and the far left extremists that the psychopaths try to foment against the system. And it says, although each group has completely different reasons for favoring such ideas. Yeah, that's really interesting. Where you do see that where you're seeing a lot of anti-fascist, Antifa people on the far left who are supporters of Israel, and they're suppressing any criticism of Israel because of anti-Semitism concerns. And then you're seeing people on the far right who view Israelis as the chosen people, and they are suppressing any criticism of Israel based off of the Israelis supposedly being the chosen people who are going to fulfill prophecies. So it's really interesting how both sides are supporting Israel for very different reasons. Okay, so going on, since ideology is simply a means for the psychopath to liberate themselves from what they feel are oppressive normal human customs, this person warns every great social movement can thereby become a host upon which some pathocracy initiates its parasitic life. And that insight is also vindicated by modern psychological research. This paper theorized that many narcissists holding left-wing authoritarian views would just as easily hold right authoritarian views if it provided a better vehicle to satisfy the needs of their ego. Yeah, I do see that quite frequently, particularly when it comes to Zionism. Okay, so it says that antagonistic narcissism is not only a strong predictor of left-wing authoritarianism, but simultaneously predict SDO, a trait that is related to right-wing authoritarianism. I don't know. See, it didn't describe here what SDO is, but it says it's a trait clearly related to right-wing authoritarianism. These results also show that some individuals with high levels of antagonistic narcissism may be motivated to endorse either left or right-wing ideological attitudes, depending on which of these attitudes seems to be more opportune to them given a specific situation, thus is necessary to argue. Okay, so it cuts off there. So we do see that these types of narcissistic psychopathic traits do lead to right-wing and left-wing narcissism, or right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. And you can see this as well because people switch back and forth between being kind of content creators for right-wing or left-wing authoritarianism pretty frequently. I mean, you kind of saw this with Zionism, where there were so many people on the right who were anti-cancel culture. And then as soon as people start criticizing Israel, they were very pro-cancel culture. And so this ends with, this means we would expect narcissists and psychopaths to be especially attracted to ascendant movements, which allow them to cancel, dominate, and terrorize others. And you really saw this back in, say, the 80s and 90s, where there were narcissistic psychopaths in a lot of Christian circles who were canceling things like Harry Potter. And then as soon as it became more popular to cancel things from a left-wing authoritarian perspective, they absolutely went and did that. So today, this is provided by the radical left, especially in the form of anti-whiteism and the trans movement. Yeah, you definitely see that, where there are definitely a lot of narcissism and a lot of psychopathy in the anti-white movement. So I thought this was a very good thread by Keith Woods on psychopathy, narcissism, and right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. If you found this video to be helpful, informative, anything like that, please give us a thumbs up. It does help us in the algorithm. Please subscribe to our channel for more content on YouTube and Rumble. We are getting a lot more views on Rumble, which is really interesting. We know we're being suppressed in the algorithm on YouTube. And please leave us a comment in the comment box below. I do read all of them. I respond whenever necessary. Any questions, concerns, critiques you might have. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.